is the webinar, Bind Best Practices from Day 1 from ISC, and our presenter today is Eddy Winstead from Raleigh, North Carolina. He is ISC's Senior Sales Engineer and our consultant. He has about 20 years experience in systems engineering and DNS. He was the DNS guy, the sole DNS person for an ISP for a while down in North Carolina. And since he's been at ISC, he has worked in technical support. He's worked as a sales engineer and also as a consultant. So he is the person who would go out and visit a customer if they had a problem, and in particular if they had a need for a DNS audit like we're going to discuss today. So Eddy, you've got the controls. You can go ahead and advance to the first slide so we can warn everyone about the recording and the logistics. There we go. So this webinar, there you go. This webinar is going to be recorded, and we will post a recording. Everyone is muted, but you are encouraged to type questions into the Q&A tab or the chat tab, and we will answer them if we can as we go. Otherwise, we'll go through the questions at the end of the webinar. And here's Eddy. As I mentioned, he is our Senior Sales Engineer, and this webinar is a little bit different because usually we talk about how to use a particular bind feature or feature set, and instead this is a little bit more operational. It's kind of the scenario is if you are dropped into a situation where you suddenly have to take over the DNS, perhaps the previous DNS administrator left, perhaps it was a result of an acquisition or a merger, something like that, or perhaps you're simply having a security and operations audit, maybe something that management asks for, and you're trying to sort of quickly assess the situation and figure out how to go forward. So that's the agenda for this morning. So go ahead, Eddy.
All right, thank you, Vicki. So yeah, that is my somewhat lovely picture there, I suppose. So I've been with ISC for a little over 5 years now, and as Vicki mentioned, a lot of my prior work was at a research and education ISP in North Carolina. They used to say about 25% of my job was allocated for DNS, but that was always the absolute favorite part of my job. So I always thought if I could just do DNS full time, that would be great. And I was fortunate enough to, or have been fortunate enough to work with ISC for the past 5 years. So most of my time is DNS. I do some of what we call, or what I call the broccoli of network engineering. I do some DHCP as well. But DNS is sort of my passion. So one of the absolute favorite things about my job is actually exactly what is the topic of today, which is, I get to go see lots and lots of differing types of configurations in many, many different environments, and this is very enjoyable to me. I see someone has joined from Zurich. I suspect that's just the company Zurich, but Zurich is actually one of my favorite places that I've been able to go and check out people's DNS configs. So let's get right to it. So Vicki sort of set this webinar up with actually a couple of weeks ago when I was visiting out in Redwood City, and she posed this question to me, and that is, what would I do if I was dropped into an existing organization to run their DNS? Now, this graphic is actually from the smoke jumpers, which if you have a browser handy, you may want to look up in the future about smoke jumpers. It was an interesting unit in the U.S. Army, but essentially their purpose was to fight fires domestically. So when someone poses a question to me about looking at their DNS, it's usually because there may not be an immediate fire, but usually there's some smoke around, right? And one thing that's interesting to me is often as I travel around is how people got involved in the DNS. And almost, I'd say 95% of the time, usually you had some background in Unix, and therefore this somehow qualified you to be a DNS admin. So we always get a good chuckle about this, but that's how most of us ended up doing DNS administration. Myself included. I knew how to, my background started in Unix and then very quickly went specific to DNS and DHCP. My first action like I said, I do this on a regular basis here at ISC, and let me just say straight off, like, one of the greatest things about working at ISC is that the users come up with insane configurations. So, and that can be for all meanings of insane. Insane in a very good way. Like sometimes we see configurations and we see things that people have been able to achieve by configuration tweaks that we never thought about using those specific options for. So that's a very fun part of the job. All the way to the other side of other extreme of insane, in that sometimes we see things and we are just amazed that the DNS is still working. Well, that's sort of one of the points about DNS best practices is, the DNS works. And you can do really bad things to a configuration and it will still kind of work. That speaks volumes to the protocol design, and but it's definitely a double-edged sword in that sometimes you can have improper configurations in place, but no user complaints. And user complaints is typically what gets everyone fired up and taking a peek at their configurations to see what's going on. But in a lot of cases that we run into, like I said, there will be misconfigurations, but typically the protocol itself will handle a lot of these cases. So anyway, back to this question that Vicki posed to me, what would I do? Well, the first, of course, is I would totally freak out. And like I said, if you found the DNS in the same way that I did, that was sort of how it first happened. I freaked out, right? So here I am, a Linux admin, Unix admin, Solaris, old Sun OS stuff, and I get handed this DNS service, which, as you all know, with the DNS, it's one of those things where we all understand that if you can get to things by IP address, then the network is not broken. But for the general user, if they can't get to something by name, suddenly that means the internet is broken, and generally this is seen as not a good thing. So it's often a strangely neglected area in an organization, but it is extremely critical, as you all know. So here's the other part about how you start out as a DNS admin. Is it usually, again, back to this 90 to 95% of the time, it depends on the environment that you inherit. So you knew some form of NIX and you got tasked with DNS, and usually there's something already in place. And I was very fortunate in that part of what was already set up was very well done in my first exposure to DNS. So I learned things, quote unquote, the right way. I knew about RFCs and those sorts of things pretty quickly. Of course, I found out by making mistakes, but anyway, that's how we learn. So anyway, if I'm dropped into place, yeah, I'm going to freak out a little bit. Then I'm going to get some caffeine. Mountain Dew is my caffeine of choice. But then I'm going to take a deep breath, and we're going to go ahead and start taking a look at things. The first thing I'm going to do is, if I drop somewhere, do you have any network or infrastructure diagrams? I want to get a visual survey, if you will, of what you think the network looks like. And again, a lot of times when you're dropped into places, what is handed to you is not exactly what is done in practice. But we're going to be walking through a lot of that in a bit. So just as an example, I've been handed this here diagram. And so some things jump out at me right away. So in this case, I know just by looking at this, 192.168, okay, they've given me a diagram for a private network, okay? So they've asked me to come look at their DNS, and in this case, currently I'm only looking at the private portion, right? But I see some things, like I see that, okay, we have some good separation of function. So we have a server that listens on 2 IP addresses that does authoritative functions, and we have a server, this 253 here, that does recursive service. And then we also have over here a server that appears to be a root server. Now, if I'm on a private network, so there's these things that I can start learning just by seeing these diagrams. And one of the ones that jumps out to me on this one is, okay, we have a private root situation going on. Those of you that have private roots internally, now what this means is, if you're new to DNS, is the root system itself, there are 13 root name server instances. ISD happens to run froot. And this is for the big I internet that we all know. So the DNS protocol is designed for delegation. So if I am the owner of isc.org, then the authorities for .org can delegate isc.org to me, to my name servers, and that's sort of how the whole thing works. Now, on the recursive side, you have what's called root hints, so that you know from the very first startup how to talk to these root name servers, and then that allows you as a recursive server to learn the DNS tree, so to speak. Now, if I am sitting on a network that has a root server that is not on the, it's not in the root hints, it has its own root server, then suddenly I know, okay, I'm dealing with a private root. And if this is my immediate response, if I was if I was dropped in this case, then suddenly I'd be a little concerned, because private roots can be tricky. Those of you on the call that have to administer those will know what I'm talking about, because queries will not be responded to in the same way or even performed in the same way as they would if you didn't have a private root. So some of that is some trickiness. If there's anyone on the call that happens to have attended any of our training courses, then you may recognize this diagram. It's actually from our training course. But that's some of the things that I see here, and then I see these D2P pool. I see some users that are going to be making use of these servers. Now, again, this is just for, this example was for an internal network. Of course, if you're on the ISP level or non-enterprise level, you'll have a much different diagram, and you may have, things located in different data centers, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, always ask for a diagram. If you get one, great. And if you get an accurate one, even better. So the next step we're going to do, though, is we're going to pick one of these name servers and we're going to log in. Assuming, I know I've been some places where the first day, it takes a couple of days actually for you to get login access. That always drives me insane. I suspect it does you as well. But anyway, once I'm able to work out how to get on these name servers, then I log in very simply. And in today's talk, we're going to be talking about bind best practices. A lot of this will also apply to DNS as a protocol in general. But in bind specific terms, once I get on the server, the very first thing I do is I run named-V. Now, sometimes you're able, you log in, you're able to find the path of named. Sometimes you don't. You may have to go hunting around to see where named actually is. Very often it'll be in user local SBIN. But anyway, you run a named-V. A lot of people aren't aware of this V, and it's a very handy little tool, because it tells you not only the version that you're running, but it tells you what configuration options were used when this was built. It'll also tell you things like what OpenSSL version bind is using, if it's using one. These can be incredibly helpful when you inherit an environment. In best practice, I tend to, in 95% of the cases, I encourage people to use when you download bind, if you install it from source, I encourage people to use /configure without any options, especially the first time. We take great pains to try to figure out exactly what type of server you're on, how many CPUs you have, et cetera, and we attempt to do the right thing with configure. That said, if you're an advanced admin and you need to do things like you want to enable threads, or you don't want to use OpenSSL for some reason, there are other options that you can play around with ./configure, but best case scenario, just run it straight off and see what it finds. So back to this named-v, this is a handy way to see what was this built with. So again, I'm dropping into a situation where I don't know much of anything about these systems and what they're running. So I want to get a look or a glimpse at what the prior admin put in place. You also want to check, of course, like what OS is the server running. How was named started on this box? Some of this is going to get into general sysadmin stuff, but if I do a PS and I see named is running, hopefully it's running, right? I see named is running. I want to look and make sure that the command with which named was started on this box, it matches what's in the startup scripts. Or is there a startup script for named? These are the kind of things that I'm going to start going through and looking at. You'd be surprised how many times named has been started on the command line and sort of left that way. So sometimes I find named running and it doesn't match the way it started in the startup scripts, which if the box ever reboots, this is going to be a problem for you, or could potentially be a problem. So you want to make sure that those match. You want to know whether or not there's a nanny script in use. Now, a nanny script is something that if bind dies, it will automatically restart it. Now, I'm going to remain agnostic on a lot of things, and one of those is whether or not you want to use a nanny script. So there are pros and cons both ways. Of course, DNS is a service that you always want it to be running. So a lot of times you want a nanny script so that if bind dies, it gets restarted and the server starts back. Now, one of the cons to nanny scripts, though, are I've seen a lot of people not know that they were having an issue with bind for quite a while because there were no reports of any service outage. Now, we're going to get into monitoring a little bit later, but when you're brand new in an environment, maybe you want the nanny script to not be there because you want to know about any problems that are happening. Here's an example of a named-v, and the example I chose is because this one's a little out of date. So here I have I've done a named-v. I see that we have a 9.8.4-P2 build of bind. So my first response in seeing that was, okay, I'd sort of make a mental note that we're going to be doing some upgrades pretty soon. By 9.8, we don't, and you have to be careful with the versioning sometimes, because if you got this bind from a distro, say you got it from CentOS or Red Hat, Debian, whatever your flavor is, very often the version number does not match what ISC releases as the version number. So you have to be careful. So this would be one of my next questions. Did this named come from one of the distros? Did someone do a yum update or whatever? And if they did, maybe I need to make sure what all fixes, and particularly security fixes, are included in that distro's version that matches this string. Again, you may have something like bind 9.9 has certain features and certain patches applied to it from ISC, and then the distro might apply those same patches, but they may keep the version name the same. So you want to kind of look out and see what's going on with that. So one of the things I tend to do, though, is try to keep folks on the most recent version. And that said, we did just release bind 9.11. Typically in a production environment, unless I'm wanting to test particular features or test actually on behalf of ISC and send some results, then typically I say don't install a .0. Again, a lot of my background has been in operations, so I'm aware that you don't make changes that entice the pagers to go off. So I typically don't recommend a .0. Once you get to like a .2 minor release, then you can start thinking about going to that. Again, unless you have a specific feature that you absolutely want to have, such as in 9.11, we have catalog zones that a lot of folks are interested in. Let's see. All right, so the next thing I would do then is I would go on to named.conf. And I'm going to look in here, and the first thing I'm going to take a look at is the global options. And do the things listed in there actually make sense? Now, for me, most of my time is spent looking at these things, so I can do this maybe a little quicker than most. If I don't know what a particular option is and what its setting should be or what its default setting is, then I can always check the Bind 9 ARM or Administrator's Reference Manual for that information. But I would essentially do, and I'm going to walk through an example one here in a second, but I would go through each of the global options and just make sure that, just to see what they're set to and see if they make sense to me. The other thing that we're going to start getting into at this juncture is, remember I talked about the diagram that you may or may not have been given. If you were given a diagram, this is when you start lining up if those name servers are actually doing what the diagram says they ought to be doing. So for my example diagram, I had a recursive server, I had an authoritative server. Are they actually configured to do those functions? So this is where you start checking to make sure that the diagram is correct and things are happening as they should be, or not. In many cases we find, particularly, I know we all love documentation. I certainly do not, but I do it. But typically you'll find some of the documentation will be out of date. Sometimes there's not any documentation. So anyway, you're just trying to figure out at this point exactly what you're walking into. And then we're going to do a basic security check. Now, the topic of this webinar is best practices from day one. So as I'm going through all these things, it's the best practices that I'm looking for. When we talk about DNS security, one of the ones that we want to make sure is that the zone transfers are TSIG secured. This is a way to ensure that if I'm a secondary server, I am getting data from the master server that I should be getting it from. And then if I am a master server or a slave or secondary, then I want to configure allow transfer to only come from the servers that I know are my secondary servers. And then a very important one is this allow-query. And if I have a recursive server that I'm taking a look at, is allow-query configured? And most importantly, is it not set to any? Open resolvers are not good internet practice these days. Why is that so? They are used in the majority of the DNS DDoS attacks. So if I can send a very small, I should point out here that a lot of DNS takes place over UDP. So there's no three-way handshake that you would have required with TCP. So via UDP, I can spoof my source rather easily. So if I know that you're running an open resolver, then I can ask, number one, I can ask that resolver questions. And then number two, I could spoof my address. So I could ask you a very small question. What is www.isc.org, and I want to know its DNSSEC information again. So I can ask a very small sized question and produce some very large answers to send back at a third party who would be very unhappy to receive those. So we want to make sure good network hygiene is not running open resolvers. Now that said, of course, I have been in an operations or I find myself in a lot of operation settings as well where people have open resolvers because of various reasons. Again, I'm going to remain agnostic on whether or not those are valid, but I understand the operational pain of, say, I have ended up in a lot of places where people don't know the IP addresses of their valid clients. So that puts you as a DNS administrator in a tough spot. Do you start clamping down the queries access to only the IPs that you know about? If you do that, then you're probably going to deny some service to some customers, and this is not going to make folks happy. So there's always a balancing act with this. But in general, you know, first day in, I'm trying to figure out, am I running an open resolver? So for those of you that have been doing bind name servers for a while, you'll notice, you'll recognize this sort of text immediately. This is my global options. So we'll just walk through these as I would in looking at someone else's. So here I have a directory. So my directory, in this case, my working directory for named is Etsy namedb. I am doing DNSSEC. So I have enabled DNSSEC, and I am going to do DNSSEC validation on behalf of clients. Now, in this case, I'm not going to do any recursion, though. This is interesting. So I have said I'm going to validate, but I'm not going to do recursion for anyone. Okay, that's good. I am allowing query for anyone. Okay. So these last two lines here, this points out to me that, okay, I'm not going to do recursion, but I am going to allow query from anyone. This, to me, says that this server is an authoritative server. So again, going back to your diagram, I would then note on that diagram by hand or whatever that, yes, this server actually is an authoritative server, or the diagram says this server should be a recursive server and is, in fact, an authoritative server. But so now I see that we have an authoritative server here. It's not allowing any transfers of its zones. This is fine at this point. I suspect then that this server is going to allow transfer on a per zone basis. This server is also not going to send any notifies. Again, these are global options, so they apply to all zones. And I suspect, again, at this point, that any notify configuration is going to be done at the zone level. Key directory. Okay, so here I have Etsy namedb keys. So, okay, I have DNSSEC enable, yes, and I have a key directory. This is sort of pointing out to me that, okay, I now know this is an authoritative server, and I suspect that this server is DNSSEC signing its zones because I have the key directory and I have DNSSEC enable on. So max journal size, okay, this may mean that I have some dynamic zones going on and they're being limited in size, which would be considered a best practice. Not sure about that 32K, that might be a little small, depending on the size of the zones themselves. And then I see that this server is actually doing zone statistics, so this is good. I'm feeling better about inheriting this environment because the admin has actually already turned on stats, so we're looking good. And then I see some addresses that this server is listening on. I see a v4 address and a v6, and then I have my notified source on v4 and v6 as well. So then I would go back to my diagram, because if you think back to that diagram I showed you, it only had IPv4. So now I'd be making a note to say, okay, well, this server does have an IPv6 interface, and it appears to be listening on it as well. Does it answer queries over IPv6? But I'd definitely be making a note that the server is doing IPv6 as well. All right. Once I get through my global options, the next thing I'm going to take a look at is my zone stanzas. And in this case, I have example.com. This server is a secondary or slave for example.com. My zone data is stored in a file called example.com-zone. All this is good. These are my master servers, and I'm not doing notifies for this zone. For those of you that don't know, notify is a way of making the start of authority refresh value essentially set it to 0 on another server. So back in the old days, we relied on the refresh value setting to check in with master servers or other authoritative servers to see when data had changed over a period of time. These days, of course, in the modern internet, people want their DNS just as soon as they ask for it. So we have this handy tool called Notify, which essentially alerts other authoritative servers that data on the master has changed and they need to check in and compare serial numbers. Well, one thing that jumps out to me on this particular zone stanza is I don't have TSIG enabled. So that would be one of the things that I make a note of that I may want to check and see with the other zones. Is TSIG enabled at all on this server? And if not, I probably want to do that. So to enable TSIG, there's a couple of ways I can do that for a zone. TSIG is transaction signatures. So again, it's a way of confirming that I'm getting data from the appropriate place in this particular example. I can use a tool, DNSSEC keygen, to create TSIG keys. I can add them to named.conf, and then I can have the master servers required to have the same key material. Now I can identify servers with keys, and I can do it per zone as well. All right. Now this other thing, this logging, this is a big one actually. I want to, again, I'm still in named.conf, but I want to look through the logging stanza, and I want to make sure that the stanza is actually, it makes sense and is one thing people tend to forget about actually is that sometimes you'll have a logging stanza, but for some reason, maybe some system level reason, logging is actually not occurring. This can go back to also if you have a logging stanza and logging is not occurring, one of the things to check is to make sure that you're actually, when named was started, it was started using the named.conf that you think it should use. Sometimes people will manually start named and they may use a configuration file that is not the one that would be in like the default location like etcnamedb.conf or etcnamed.conf. So anyway, are we doing the good things with the logging? Another question here is if I'm on a recursive server, am I doing query logging? Now, query logging, standard query logging, if you do this on bind, you're going to take a decent performance hit. So if I get dropped in a location where I've already been told that the recursive servers are really struggling, then one of the things I may do is just initially turn off query logging or recommend that you turn off query logging. Now, this has to be carefully considered against your policies. Some people have policies, whether it be government oversight policies or whatever, or enterprise level policies that require query logging. So if you have that, of course, you can't turn it off. But in some situations, it may be preferable to turn it off until we can architect a solution that can handle the level of queries that you have and also do the logging. Some of you may have heard of DNS Tap. DNS Tap is a way that you can do logging without the performance penalty. If you want to hear more about that, we have a webinar we did a few months ago with the author of DNS Tap, Robert Edmonds, and you can look through our webinar list and go back and check that one out. So anyway, I'm taking a look at the config, and then I'm going to have a look at the actual logs. So one of the things that I'm a big proponent of now, when you drop in a situation, you sometimes don't know what normal logging looks like, but I really tell folks a lot, like make sure you're looking at logs when things are working, because if you're not looking at the logs when stuff is working, then when stuff breaks, you really don't know what to look for, or nothing catches your eye in terms of what might be the actual problem. Now, of course, there are monitoring tools that do all this for you, and we're going to talk about some of those in a bit. but just from, day one, from an eye level, you want to take a look at the logs. And then you also want to have a look at the system logs as well, make sure syslog is working, see if you get anything from named in the system log. Here is just a sample logging stanza. So if I find this in a named.conf, I'm feeling a little better about my situation because I see that the previous admin has taken enough care to make sure we don't run out of disk space, right? So query logs can be very chatty. In this case, they're allowing 5 versions at a time, 1 meg in size. This is probably a bit small, but again, this is an example. But if I'm looking at this and I'm looking for best practices in place, having these logs rotated regularly is a good thing. Now, as we get further along, a couple of days into an assignment, I definitely want to make sure that logs are being saved by policy or that match the policy of the organization. So again, there are tools that do this for you. So I want to find out, are my DNS logs being saved off somewhere that meets or matches my policy? The other thing that I want to point out here is print time yes. This to me is, for my own sanity, is critical. I love having print time in the logs because typically the first order of business when you are debugging a problem for me is, when did it start? When did you start noticing symptoms? So with print time yes in a bind configuration, then you can go back and sort of eyeball or look at when the problem was reported, what was going on, and then you can back up because usually the problem is happening before anyone notices, right? So that is a good thing to have on. And then the other thing, I can't say this enough, but named-checkconf is your friend. A lot of people actually don't know about named-checkconf, but this is a way to have bind or have a utility that comes with bind check its configuration. Now, I will, point out that it does not check for typos. So if you have a syntactically correct typo, you're still out of business. But this will check for syntax for you. So and then it has a very handy flag that is the -z. So what this does is it will check not only my named.conf, but it will also check all the zones that this server is listed as authoritative for. It will check all the zone data and make sure that it is all valid. Sometimes you will have, when you're dropped into places, you will have a situation where zone data files have changed, but the name server hasn't been reloaded. So this would point out any syntactical problems in the zone files as well. And then RNDC, this is the next thing I'm going to check. Do I have RNDC already configured? If not, then I'm going to immediately, so far I haven't done much other than look, but if I don't have RNDC configured, I am going to go ahead and configure it. And these days, back in the old days, you had to do a lot of, create some keys and edit named.conf, et cetera, et cetera. These days, you can just do RNDC-confgen-A. If you do that, a file gets created, and if you restart named, then RNDC will be available to you. Once I do that, I'm going to do RNDC status, and I'm going to get some reports back on what's going on with named. Then the other two I listed down there, if I have already discovered, like there's some expired zones or something's just not quite right, I can force via RNDC, I have some debugging options at hand. I can force notifies, I can force a retransfer of a zone so I can check and see what might be a problem that I have inherited. All right, so that's sort of like the initial reconnaissance, if you will, that you do. And for everything that was on that diagram, I'm going to repeat for every server, every name server. I'm going to go in and look at all these same things, and I'm going to look at, and one of the things that I'd like to look at, like if I have a pool of recursive servers, then I want to make sure that their configuration is very similar. One of the things I run into a lot is people say, yes, we have, 20 recursive servers, they all do the same thing, they're all configured the same way, but as soon as I start looking at things like the global options, suddenly the configs are all over the place. So if you have servers that are doing the same, performing the same task, typically you want them to have very similar configurations. So that's something that we would look for. And again, if you have the diagrams, at this point you can start ensuring that what was diagrammed actually is still accurate or it is not. Now, some authoritative specific things. So when we talk about best practices, there's one of the things that you want is you don't want single points of failure. So you want things like I have authoritative name servers on different subnets. I want authoritative name servers in different geographic locations. So you can start to do those checks yourself. I've also put out here some tools that I always use whenever I land somewhere. Usually, actually, I've already run these by the time I get somewhere. If I know I'm going to be working with a specific entity in their DNS, then I start looking at their domains. I run DNSViz on it. DNSViz is a really awesome tool. VeriSign provides it these days. If they're doing DNSSEC, DNSViz is the first thing I'm going to run because it will show me if all the DNSSEC pieces and parts are done accurately. If they're not, it gives me a nice graphical display of what the problems may be. The other one that I run almost immediately is dnscheck.iis.se. These are from our friends over at .se, and this is a really good check. They do lots of tests on a certain domain, and they'll, again, report back to you what problems there may be. The other part of this that's very nice is, so when I get somewhere, I'm on site. So very often with authoritative servers, you may be, they may look a lot healthier right on site than they might look elsewhere. So I love these tools because they're a way for me to check things from a different network, no matter where I'm currently sitting. And then we also have a tool called ednscomp.isc.org, and this will basically, so EDNS is extension mechanisms for DNS. The DNS protocol is 33 and some odd years old. So EDNS is extension mechanisms for DNS, and it allows us to do things like the most common one that people think about is it allows us to do DNS over UDP at sizes greater than 512 bytes. It allows us to do this DNS message sizes up to 4096 bytes. But anyway, one of the telltale signs that you have some firewall fun going on is checking for EDNS compliance. So I would put a domain into this ednscomp.isc.org. By the way, all these tools that I've listed here are free. There's no, nothing you need to pay for or anything like that. And then some series of checks are going to be run, and the EDNS one is very useful in pointing out firewall misconfigurations. One thing that's kind of interesting at this point in DNS evolution, if you will, a lot of times if you have lots of recursive servers, these days there are many that, and again I'm going to try to stay agnostic, but there are many folks that do not run these servers behind any firewall whatsoever. By that I mean no external firewalls. Most will have some internal firewall stuff going on the OS level, but firewalls can, can add lots of fun to your DNS configs or your DNS administration task. So anyway, so these are the tools that I would do right away. Other things for authoritative servers, of course, again, like I pointed out when we were looking at the global options, I would make sure that, you know, if I'm running authoritative servers, the point of those is to answer questions. So you want to make sure that the authoritative servers are allowing queries from anywhere, because that is their point. I will say also the next slide is going to be recursive services, and in general best practice is to ensure that your authoritative DNS function and recursive function are separated. This is for security concerns, and it is considered best practice. I will handily admit that most places I end up, they're doing some sort of mix of authoritative and recursive on almost every server. Some do not, and we appreciate them, but just know that in practice, you know, if you're doing things like RPC on a recursive server, in some ways, you know, that's sort of making yourself, that's sort of mixing the functions a little bit. So anyway, in practice, you know, things aren't always what we would like them to be. But again, if I land somewhere and I do find a mixed function server, I want to find out why that is. Why was this configured that way? And can I separate these functions out based with existing infrastructure, or if I can go talk to other folks at this organization, and we have a plan essentially to separate this functionality out. Now, if I am looking at a recursive server, you know, Dig is your friend. So I want to send a bunch of queries to these servers and make sure that they're answering appropriately. And I also want to try to query them from not on network places. I have been several places where I arrive and security assures me that there's no way you can query certain servers, and I provide them a dig output that shows otherwise. And then there's some furious typing, and then that problem is resolved. But I want to make sure that if I'm not supposed to be answering queries from clients other than my own, that I'm configured both on my name server for that or on a firewall if I have that in place as well. All right. So that's sort of a, you know, very sort of high-level view of what I would do on the first day. And then I have a slide here that's essentially what I'm going to do starting on day 2. I'm going to talk about this one, and then I think the very next slide is questions. So we're running pretty good on time, so we should have plenty of time for some questions, which are always the fun part for me. So I'm going to make sure I meet with all these teams within this organization. Now, this, you know, one of the things I always find out is where is the DNS put organizationally, because this is always a very interesting question. Sometimes you will find the DNS sits in the network operations team. Sometimes you will find the DNS folks sit with the systems team. Sometimes it'll be a blend between the two. But that will tell you a lot about how the DNS may be architected at a certain organization. But if it's you know, and then sometimes you end up in a place where you're all these things. I've been in those places as well. You take care of all these things as a DNS admin, and if that's the case, then you know, you just ask these questions of yourself, I suppose. If you're in a larger spot, which I have been in as well, then you want to talk to the teams about these things. And provisioning, you know, what I want to find out is if I have a server that dies, how fast can you all give me a new one? How fast can we get that in place? Is there a standard build? Again, when I go and look at these configs, you know, if I'm seeing several servers that are supposed to have the same function, hopefully their configurations are very similar, and hopefully even more, those configurations are standard and part of a build process that is already in place. If it's not, then that's something that we're going to have to start working on. From the operations folks, you know, this is just sort of the general question, how's your life? You can tell a lot, you know, just by asking ops folks how things are going. If they look bleary-eyed, you know, then that means things are probably not so good in operations, and we have some things to work on. With the security team, we always talk about firewalls and DNS. Again, the age-old myth is that DNS only takes place over UDP, port 53, but most security professionals know that that's not true these days. You will see DNS taking place over TCP, and that is entirely fine, and that should be allowed. And then again, back to that EDNS comp tool, you know, you want to make sure that they're not dropping any sort of options that are actually in line with the standards. And then from my monitoring team, I want to find out, number one, do we have any alerting going on? What are we alerting on? You know, do we alert when named dies? Do we alert when disk space is getting close to full? Do we alert when, I don't know, memory usage is high? These sorts of things. And the other thing I want to make sure I find out is what does my traffic look like? When we talk about DNS, in general, you want to over-provision. So in general, I like to see, you know, if I have peak traffic, I want to be able to handle, if I have some number at peak traffic, I want to be able to handle, you know, 4 times that, 5 times that, so that I can handle both peak traffic and any sort of attack that might come in at the same time. This sort of, one more thing about security that sort of goes along with this is that do you have any other tools at your disposal to handle attacks? So there are things that can scrub out traffic for you that is sort of nasty traffic, and so you want to find out if you have that in your tool bag as something you can use in the event of a DDoS attack or any sort of attack on your DNS infrastructure. And then if you meet with your architecture teams, you want to know if they have any future plans already. By the time you meet with them, you should already be able to see if you're currently provisioned adequately, and if you're not, we need to have a conversation about how soon can we get up to an adequate provisioning. And then from my management, I'm going to ask them, do they have support? A lot of people don't think about that, you know, open source is great, and we all use it, but there are times when we're not going to be able to, you know, essentially what I'm trying to say here is I don't want it to, if I'm responsible for infrastructure, I don't want to be the beginning all and end all, right? So I don't want to have to do support with me and a Google search, right? I should be able to contact the authors, maintainers of that open source software and ask them questions when I need to. So this is a question I always ask of management. Is there support available on whatever open source element we're using, and do we have it? And with that, I will open it up to any questions. And I see we've already gotten one question, but Vicki has already answered it. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we can take it from there. Go ahead, Vicki.
Well, I have a question. At the very beginning, you were talking about initially checking to see what the running version is, and then upgrading if necessary. And I have a couple of questions about that. I'll just list them out, and then you can just address whatever you think is most relevant. But so the first thing is, you said a few times that servers that have the same function should have the same configuration. Do you think all the servers should be running the same version of bind? And then the second question is, say you're running this 9.8 as in your example, how do you decide what version you would go to? And would you jump ahead a bunch of versions at once or not? And then the last thing I'll just throw out there is, how do you check and see if the version you are running today has some known published vulnerabilities that are unpatched?
Gotcha. Okay. I'm trying to remember the first question now.
Should all the servers run the same software version?
That's a very good question. So, and this is one that I have to remain, I'll try to be agnostic on as well and give the pros and cons. So there is a school of thought that you should run for operational, what's the right word? Operational ease. You should run the same software and the same version across multiple systems. Now, there's also a school of thought that says you shouldn't do that because, you could be susceptible to a zero-day vulnerability or whatnot. So there's a balance here, and it goes back to what your organization prefers. Sometimes people are required by security policy to run differing versions. So I would also point out here that some places are actually required to run differing name server software. So you could conceivably have a place that runs both bind and unbound or not DNS, any of those as well. And the next question was, go ahead.
How do you decide which version to move to if you're running this old version?
Okay, so in this case where I landed on a server that was running 9.8.4, what I would do is I would go to ISC's website and check out the differing features for each release. Now, if I'm running 9.8.4, probably what I would do is my next move would be I would probably go to 9.9. I'm of the sysadmin philosophy that I like to make as little change as possible in each iteration. So I'd probably move to 9.9 immediately because I believe 9.8 is actually EOL at this point. But I would move to 9.9, ensure that all is fine, and then that would sort of get the heat off, and then I would take my time and look at what features I may need as I learn about this new environment. And then the third question was?
How do you check to see if there are outstanding security vulnerabilities in the version that you're running? Presumably you can't update it immediately, or you might not want to.
Right.
So how do you find out if you have a burning problem there?
So for that one, you have to, it'll be sort of different for each distro. You can oftentimes look in, for me, just because of my history, what I would do is my first upgrade I would just do standard bind, right? I wouldn't do the distro because if I'm in a heated situation where I don't know all the variables yet, I would just to ensure that I don't have any vulnerabilities that are existent, I would just get the latest version of bind from the website. So again, back in this case where I have 9.8.4, I would go for the latest version of 9.9. And then that would give me time to figure out if the distros have patched for everything or not.
Okay. I don't know if this is something that is enabled by some of the distros, but you didn't mention RRL. Isn't that, I guess if they're running 9.8, they wouldn't even have response rate limiting available. Is that right?
That's correct. But if they're, well, possibly. This goes back to what I was saying. Sometimes you might have a version that appears to be or is shown from the distro as 9.8.4, and it might have the RRL functionality backported into it by the distro. So it's really hard to tell. But response rate limiting is something, you can do on the authoritative side, so that if you start getting lots and lots of queries that are the same question from the same network, DNS is designed to do caching, so you shouldn't be seeing these. So typically what this means is there's either a misconfiguration or more likely some malicious traffic. You can configure response rate limiting to limit the responses that you send back. All right, and did we actually get any from the participants?
No, I don't see any questions other than where to get the slides.
Okay, all right.
So I think, we can hang out for a sec and see if anybody comes up with another question, and then we're just about to end.
Okay, yeah, I'll sit here. We should at least get one question.
Well, somebody asked for how to get the slides, and I will be posting them on the website after the talk.
Okay, excellent.
Under the community tab down under webinars. So here's a question. What's the difference between RNDC reload and RNDC retransfer?
Okay, excellent question. Thanks, Pete. So the answer is, RNDC reload is something you would do after you have made a change to your configuration file, or named.conf, or you've made a change to one of your zone files. And then RNDC retransfer is something you would do on a secondary server that says, regardless of the serial number that I have and how it matches up to the master server or not, just go ahead and don't do the serial number checking, just give me the zone data. This is very useful. Like back in the old days, if you messed up a serial number, you actually had to do this crazy mathematical thing to make a slave server update the zone. These days, you can just do RNDC retransfer, and the serial numbers aren't checked, and you get the current zone data.
Okay, well, awesome. I guess that's it. Yeah, thank you very much, Eddy.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining.